Okay, so Gabriel Zalzman, you until just
7 days.
7 days ago were the EVP of International at Mattel. But I also heard you say Chief Commercial Officer for
Yes,
International
I
Mattel.
was until December chief commercial officer. I was advising until 7 days ago, and I just graduated, so very happy.
You've been all smiles. So thanks for joining us. Mark Laukheim. He is the CEO of Bobrick Washroom Equipment. He's based here in Los Angeles, and it's a very old company, huge sales internationally, and sort of a proud participant of the manufacturing community here in Southern California. He published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a month, 6 weeks ago, basically saying that China, the approach that Trump has taken with China is actually a good thing. So,
and that this is the right time.
and that this is the right time to do it, right? So thank you for joining us. We'll be getting that for sure. And then old GetGlobal friend is Vivek Lal, the VP of Strategy at Lockheed Martin. Thank you for joining us, Vivek. I hope you had a wonderful Diwali. We were celebrating it here. All right, so it feels like we're at the top of the business cycle, and it's an important moment. Folks have been, what we were just discussing, observing that, things could change in the way that trade agreements are written and what that would mean for their companies. So companies are watching this very closely. And we've been on a long economic run, longer than usual. So folks have been kind of preparing for a turn in the business cycle for about a year and a half or so. And it's looking like we could be here. Why do you feel that this is the right time, Mark?
Well, first of all, a couple of things. If you go back to 2016, people were saying we're going to have a recession in 2018. And in 2017, they were going to have a recession in 2019, and now in 2018 they say we're going to have a recession in 2020. And that's just people looking historically, but we don't really see the patterns of that actually happening. What we're seeing, in fact, at least on the manufacturing capacity, we have manufacturing capacity, and what we're seeing in particular, for example, with our distributors, is that they are sort of self-constrained in terms of their capacity because they don't want to add labor. They are reluctant to raise wages. So we actually see plenty of potential left in the economy. So in terms of why is it a good time? Because the economy is in fact doing very well. We're at 3.7% unemployment, and it's an opportunity for us to really sort of balance the books in terms of trade. There are two countries that we have problems with, China being sort of the biggest one in terms of trade. Our products, if we want to export them to China, it is a market for us, though right now an incredibly small one, even though it's a large potential market for our products. But we have to pay a 25% duty for our products going in there. And their products coming to the U.S. pay anywhere from 2.5% to 0. And so it really is not a level playing field. Then when you throw on top of it the intellectual property issues and the issues around just fair open trade, having a level playing field, it just does not exist. So we have an opportunity there. I think the other aspect of it too is the fact that the trade imbalance, we export to China about $130 billion worth of goods, which represents less than 1%, I think it's 0.75% of our GDP. China imports in the U.S. $506 billion worth of goods, which is 4% of their GDP. So they can sort of say that they're in this for the long run, but I think historically we've been very expedient about the way we've been doing some of our trade policy. And as Wilbur Ross, who's the Commerce Secretary, has talked about, the fact that we are operating under tariffs and a regime that was designed to help bring China into the global trade, and the same thing, for example, with Europe, and so now really seems to be the right time for us.
Carla, how do you feel about the difference in the way that we're treated, right? I think one thing that the China watching community and the business community that's done a lot in China seem to be kind of on Trump's side about is that, yes, something needs to be done about this because it hasn't been good. And you mentioned in the last session that these are things that we should definitely be taking China to the mat for. So what do you think should be done about it? Do you feel that his view is on point for the clients that you've been dealing with, and where should we go?
Well, I agree with the statement that we have an illness. I think the president has said this is an illness, an economic illness where China is not living up to its commitments made in 2001. Where I think we fall short is with the prescription. I think the prescription is faulty, and I think it's going to create the potential for more disharmony and disruption of our economy, when in effect, I think the timing was right to have the illness fixed, if you will. So my objection is not what we see, but how we're dealing with it. And we clearly have developed a lot of friction. The 301, that's a trade remedy, tariffs that we have put on a range of things. Really, I don't think tariffs are a super way to get a good outcome in a negotiation, because they affect us. You know, when you think about what did our trading partners do when we put tariffs on them, not only China on the 301, but our national security tariffs on all our closest allies, and they retaliated, which you could have predicted. Their tariffs have hurt us. Who is our largest soybean buyer? It's China. Who is our largest corn buyer? It's Mexico. And I can go down the list, but we haven't felt all the pain. I think that the agricultural community has been hit between the eyes most up to date. That is, they suffered about $37 billion worth of crop loss. But I think others will feel the pinch too. And I would rather we sit down and negotiate and have a plan, a strategy, what it is we want in each of these sectors and timing.
Can I respond to that?
Please,
You know,
please.
I think I certainly understand that viewpoint. I think one of the advantages, though, that we have is that most of our exports, a lot of them are commodity driven. They are things like soybeans. So China now is buying Brazilian soybeans instead of U.S. soybeans. But the reality is an agricultural commodity is a commodity. You can sell it, in fact, to other countries. The products that are coming from China are more manufactured products that are a lot more difficult to sell here. I think one of the real values, I mean, there's two things that happen. I think one, from a kind of a short-term perspective, what we've seen is, at least in the last year, there's been a devaluation of the yuan of about 10%. So that's taken part of it. We have a few suppliers in China. We've gotten about 10% reduction in terms of price negotiations with them. So I think a lot of companies are doing that. So I don't think there's going to be any immediate view in terms of, and I think companies are really trying to kind of hold the line on that. But what it really did was for the companies that are overly dependent upon China as a source. And I have one friend who's got a business who imports 100% of his product from China. It reminds us that there is political risk in the world. And that if you are going to have all of your sourcing and all of your products come from a country where there's an authoritarian regime, and then you are subject to political risk. And I think one of the things that is happening is that the companies that have been involved in that are now have to say, hey, we have to diversify where we're purchasing these goods and be less reliant on China. Let's look at Vietnam. Let's look at other countries. And number two, I think the other aspect of it, and we've seen it from on our customer side, is that they have forgotten how to buy domestically. That all of their supply chain, everybody that they're dealing with, they're sourcing from China, and to get them to shift to buy from the U.S. again is a really difficult thing for them to do, and they are having to sort of retool their whole supply chain and look at diversifying that. I think those are things that strengthen the U.S. position in the world, and I think this is, in fact, I think tariffs are the only tool that we have to bring China to the table, because they will just sit and talk and talk and talk. And, you know, we're going to be in exactly the same position 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, because we've known about this problem for a long time, and nothing's been done. So I think.
So we've got two other people who are also in that mix, and I'm super curious about, you know, you were undeterred, I guess, by the complications of dealing with China. How do you, I guess, put side by side your concerns when you were at Mattel and the difficulties that you faced in China, which I'm sure there were some.
I do think that we're talking.
It's nice to be, especially the larger size of Mattel, right? But what's the difference?
Well, I do think we're talking the supply side of the issue. There's clearly a demand side to it. Some of the benefit is that we don't discuss inflation anymore around the world, and that is because the supply chain has become extremely productive. The thing on the timing or how it's been done is that you need to adjust the supply chain process. That takes a lot of time. Fortunately, in Mattel, that had been done over a long period of time, but to solve somebody that sources 100%, like your friend, in a matter of a tweet, it's very hard. So the way to confront it, if it's by shock and tariffs, becomes a real hinder to the overall supply chain. And it will have consequences either on the scarcity of products and on the pricing of products. As we talked this morning, some of the common cycles that we were used to be running the past 30 years are coming to an end. So this thing of not having inflation and creating just dropping a wrench into the supply chain system of the world might have an impact on costs and way of living. I do agree that opening the Chinese market is extremely relevant. I do think that the Chinese government is looking at ways of doing that and creating more fair space, not only for products like yours, but also for content and for IP, which is crucial. So my whole thing is that disruption, the solve takes years, and the disruption is in a tweet.
So then, if you could make a wish of the appropriate person on both sides of the issue, in the U.S. government and the Chinese government, to solve Mark's problem, like what would you say? What would you want to try and get a little bit closer to a solution on this? What do you think is the right method that would help you?
Well, this is classical negotiation strategy, right?
Right.
So you know what you're going to put in front of the table. You know where there's going to be win-wins and try to go after them, and then aim to a common solution from both sides, because there's again win-wins for both societies on dealing with the issue. Now, if you're spinning, I understand. Negotiations, sometimes somebody has to get up off the table and create some kind of disturbance for them to go on. But when do they overflip the trend and just create something that is not remediable anymore?
So then it sounds to me like we kind of agree that this is a negotiation tactic. We may not like the way that it looks and feels and sounds. I don't know what else could we be doing right now? I mean, obviously teaming up with allies, which you've advocated, and taking them to the WTO, but that can be a lengthy process as well. Like, what do you feel about what they're saying?
Well, I do think that when you have 8 people facing you, 8 nations facing you that represent 80% of global trade, that you have a much stronger voice than if you stand there alone and are actually a little, at least allegedly, outside the bounds of the rules that you helped create 70 years earlier. And so I think that standing together and working with your allies is an important thing. We have to keep in mind that it isn't just the bilateral trade with a single corporation. A lot of corporations have invested in China and are complaining because of percentage caps on certain sectors they can enter into and a host of other grievances that they have because they want to tap into that 1.3 billion person market. So the other thing we have to remember is about 60% of what we import from China are intermediate products. They're not the final product. And that makes, in very many cases, our product that we make here more competitive globally so we can sell it worldwide. And so we want to keep the market open. We don't want to put a wall up and say, no, we don't want to deal with China. We simply want China to abide by the market rules.
So Vivek, you have sort of a unique situation in the global economy, right? Being a defense company, you don't trade the way that everyone else does. How are you reading the political environment and the global situation at the moment, and how Lockheed Martin makes its decisions about where to go and what to do? Obviously, India has come up in a big way for Lockheed, and the relationship there has been very strong. But what's your read on the global situation in light of all of this?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. I think
You can probably hear us fine though anyways, right?
Yeah.
This is for YouTube.
Yeah, so I think
So we want the mics. We do.
yeah.
Okay.
It's an excellent question. I think taking the conversation, kind of looking internally at corporations and what corporates I think need to do in this new environment, a ever-changing environment as we're seeing it domestically and globally. I can think of 5 strategies, if you will, internally. And as you know, a strategy is not a strategy unless you resource it appropriately. And so I think there are 5 elements that we look at, and certainly one of them is technology and being able to innovate and stay ahead of the curve. And that is a critical piece of strategy that bears fruit in different countries. There's this concept of localization where you have your global strategy, but you have to be localized in that country. And you mentioned India, so as the US and India's relationship converges, we see a huge potential there, of course, for cooperation, and there are various stakeholder buckets that one has to address in that pursuit. The other is business integrity. So as one is working in this new environment and often changing environment, one of the pillars or strengths that you can take away for American companies is business integrity and ethics, and that's an important factor moving forward. Employee well-being, and what I mean by that is, and we were talking about this a little earlier, there's quite a competition to get the right resources globally for every corporation, and so to be able to stay ahead of that curve, to have the right training programs in place, to be able to identify the right folks for your objectives has become very important. Of course, everyone talks about sustainability, so the other aspect is resource efficiency. So you have to be able to use your materials, your people, etc., in a more efficient way than others because it's getting to be an increasingly competitive environment. And finally, I would say information security. I think this is the big elephant in the room globally, and as we go to these different challenges that we talk about with disputes between countries on a bilateral or trilateral basis, I think information security will be a bigger and bigger challenge that every corporation has to address.
So when we take a step back and we look at where we are globally, and how to think through how to prioritize, where to allocate resources based on what we're seeing, Mark, you know, from the perspective of a company like yours, where do you prioritize? How are you looking at the situation right now and rearranging or changing where you place your resources and time and effort? What's hot for you?
Well, I mean, interesting for us, the things that, I mean, a couple areas. Obviously, the global market is still an important market for us. Right now, actually, the domestic market is a big market for us because of the tariffs. We're globally competitive as a manufacturer, and so we think that there are some companies that have been buying from China, so that's certainly going to open that up for us once they start to learn how to buy from the U.S. again. So that's good. So we're putting resources there. We are continuing to expand. I think one of the things I think a lot of companies are doing is they are somewhat supply constrained, in particular on the labor side. So we're continuing to increase our wage rates. And I think, both starting wages, we saw some wage compression. One of the other issues that's happening too is, and I think we're seeing a little bit of the fallout from the Great Recession that started, people are starting to forget. It's been, about 10 years now. So we had individuals, for example, that didn't retire because their 401ks really got decimated, following the Great Recession. Well, guess what? Their 401ks have come back. And they are now starting to retire. So we're seeing people who, are in their late 60s, even early 70s now who are retiring, and those folks have to be replaced. So there's a real war for talent. So we're continuing to raise wages, make sure that we've got the right kind of culture, the right kind of environment for our employees, that we're an attractive place to work. And so that's really the real battle that we're facing right now. But from a sales standpoint, we're continuing to do well. We're growing globally. One of the bright spots actually now is the Middle East has come back. There's a little bit, who knows how long that's going to last, but that's been a very good market for us as well. So overall, we continue to see good growth for the next couple of years.
And from where you, until very recently at Mattel, where you were sitting and looking at the world, what kinds of perceptions were you having and are you having about how especially companies in retail and e-commerce, folks who are dealing with media a lot, content. What's your read of the situation? Where should folks be spending a little bit more time? Maybe on a regional level, right? Like Southeast Asia doesn't get the love that it deserves sometimes, even though there's a lot of growth there. Middle East, of course, is a really interesting story. What's your take?
I do believe that those two areas, the retail space and also the content and consumer space, have been transforming a very, very fast pace. So creating the capabilities to address those two places and addressing how your product relates to the new retailers, e-retailing around the world, and the new consumers and what they're expecting out of their products, how they integrate with their phone or whatever other issues they want to solve. I think that's part of the investment of transforming a company that has been for over 100 years in the world, is understanding the technological shift, understanding that some of the legacy companies that were there won't be anymore, that the barriers of entry are coming down. So what used to be a strength might not be a strength anymore, and that transformation needs to happen fast. And I do think that the fastest you start experimenting on any of these fronts, the quicker you'll get to your company to be at a better place for the future. Otherwise, there's risk on the longevity of your company. So capabilities and understanding technology, for me, it's crucial for the future of any business. Yeah.
How are you staying close to consumers, right? I mean, there's an amazing, interesting cultural component in what you offer, right? You and I did a podcast recently where you said there's not a whole lot of difference between children around the world and how they want to integrate, play with toys and enjoy the process of opening them and all of that, right? So, but the parents are another matter, and how they prioritize potentially education or other elements that could be culturally influenced. How are you staying close? This is a wild moment for culture too.
One of the first, not the first, but the toy industry was an early adopter of global supply because the product moves well from one territory to the other. And my argument is if there's a toddler in the plains of Mongolia, or you have a French toddler, or you have a Peruvian toddler, they press a button, a light comes up, you have a smile. That's the reaction, and it happens everywhere in the world. Now, how the family perceives the value of that experience, how much they're willing to pay, what they attribute or what they want in their house or they don't want in their house, that's the cultural barrier. We do research around the world, and we have play labs, and now the communication is faster. As soon as a kid, and content travels well globally too, especially for kids. So you get a lot of feedback, two-way communication from content being deployed in YouTube or content being deployed on your own channels. That's source of information all the time. But we have that duality of having a very global user and a very unique and somebody that really safeguards what comes into their house, which are the parents, and that's more culturally driven.
So taking a break from toys for 1 second, let's go back to guns and bombs. Just kidding. They make more than just guns and bombs. What I'm saying is, you've laid out some really interesting ideas about how to stay close to your end consumer, right? Which is governments and all the stakeholders that influence opinions and how they evaluate what they need and what they want to buy and the way that they think about their environment. It's a wild time for populism, nationalism. Feels a little bit like there are some realignments in the way that folks are thinking about how they position themselves with their neighbors and even with the U.S. I know that that's probably a little bit in the sensitive direction, but what I'm thinking is, what are you has anything changed in the way that you stay close to those stakeholders? And are your priorities still the same as far as who you spend time trying to read, right, or influence?
Julian, I think the national security strategies in most countries, they span across governments, and these doctrines, especially in democratic societies, span several governments, and so including their procurement cycles, including their their ability to stay at the forefront and their manufacturing thought process on it, and their indigenous plans. So therefore, we're looking at very large time horizons when they make strategic plans to modernize their fleets, etc. And so I don't see too much perturbation in those longer-term procurement ideas and thoughts. Having said that, those are constantly under review. There are emergency procurements, etc., depending on geopolitics, etc. And so I feel, on an average, fulfilling their national security strategies. Let's talk about India for a second. I mean, they have been largely dependent on imports, and they're probably the world's largest procurer of arms. And there is a strategy for Prime Minister Modi to make in India now. And so they would like to increase their own defense industry and have foreign OEMs come in and help with that. And so I've seen a very deliberate set of policies to try and encourage that. And so companies like ours are engaged in trying to support that effort, whether it is fighters, whether it's in the space-based arena, whether it's in this surface or subsea. All those elements converge into a national doctrine, and I see the tendency of countries to not just want to buy something, but also how does that procurement help the local industry come up, so to speak. And so this issue of counter trade, so when a country procures, let's say, a set of arms or ammunition, and they then have a counter trade clause where there's a certain amount of offsets one has to do in that country. And so every country has its own philosophy on what that looks like and what percentage that is. But that's something we have to factor in our business model.
So dwelling on India for a moment, you've managed to get some amazing things done in India. When you were at General Atomics, I think within 3 months of the new Trump administration coming in, there was a large sale of it was Predators?
Predators, yeah.
So folks were still trying to find the bathroom in the Trump administration, and somehow moving, a large order like that. And of course, we know that it takes, commerce, it takes state, and it takes defense to sign off on something like this. But on the India side, it's also complex. So, and then recently, everything with the F-16 that you've been up to. What's the secret to relationships in India and in the U.S. government? And how do you make these things work the way that you do? I'm just kind of dying to know.
Yeah, six buckets of stakeholders, the way I see it. One is the political spectrum, not only those that are in government, but those that are not in government, but can come back into government. As I said, some of these span over several governments. So addressing that political spectrum, making them understand what's the benefit to them from an overall perspective, but a benefit to the country that by procuring a certain type of equipment from a national security strategy. Then there's the bureaucracy. So some of these countries have large bureaucracies that have systematic process and systems in place. So one has to understand that and sort of navigate through that to make sure that one is in compliance and making sure the bureaucrats understand the larger picture of what's going on. The third element are the industry captains in the country. So unless the industry captains feel that this a procurement of a large size is of significance to the industrial base, it will not go very far. Media is another, communications, double-edged sword. So you have to be able to state your case appropriately in the media so that you're addressing the benefits to the country. And then finally, which is often ignored, is the academia. So there's a lot of track 1.5, track 2 dialogues that go on, and those are, people that are not on org charts but really influence decision makers from the academic community. Those are very important. So once you have all those various buckets of stakeholders aligned on a national endeavor, I think things work out much better.
So I putting together GetGlobal, I see, the way that folks think about, who they need to talk to. It's amazing how many companies, from the scooter companies that are expanding so quickly right now to, Uber and Lyft have had to go through this domestically and Uber internationally. Thinking in those terms is not just for defense. It's everybody that is, doing something where the government can get involved somehow. So I want to move down the line a little bit and ask everybody about their top opportunity and their top risk that they see right now. Make it medium term. I think we're waiting for governments to get settled. There's a lot that just changed. But Carla, what do you see as the top opportunity internationally for companies that are engaged in the world, and the top risk?
The opportunity is to take advantage of the world beyond our borders. If we have a great product and great products are represented here, we don't want to just sell them here. We want to sell them in competition abroad. The old rule of comparative advantage works. And the risk I see is that we see a tide of populism sweeping our country, but also Europe and to Latin America, to even into Asia. And here at home, we have to begin to deal with it. But I don't think we've come to grips with it. At least the population hasn't come to grips with it. The fact of the matter is, I think it was mentioned, we are great on manufacturing. We are producing twice as much manufactured goods today as we did in 1985, but with half as many workers. And if you are a worker who was laid off, probably because of technology, but also international competition or just incompetence of the company that was being run in your community, you don't want to hear a lecture about why you are worried about your future. And we have 7 million unfilled jobs in the United States. It is clear that we need to have a program that trains those who've been dislodged or who have run out of the skills to deal with the 21st century economy, and the youngsters who are coming up to deal with the employment opportunities. And I think it's going to take a public-private partnership. The government can provide a stipend to give you the support you need for the 20 weeks of training, and even a stipend to geographically relocate. And a company can provide the training, and some are doing that, and to their great advantage. But too few are doing it, and we need to have a really good training program that takes those guys that are 35 to 50 who've they've lost their jobs, and to train them for the jobs that exist and are screaming for them. And I think that we have an opportunity, and we have a risk if we don't take advantage of that opportunity.
So beating the pavement out in DC, it's amazing to me how many really senior policy mandarins, this is like the number one thing that they think about. It's future of work issues. When we see it, coming up in news or conferences and things like that, this is so bright red, flashing alarm type material that it's just tremendously worrying. Gabriel, what do you think? Top risk, top opportunity?
I still believe that middle class formation around the world and the kind of markets that exist out there that they were not there before are an incredible opportunity for any company. Now, you're creating communities that link more around their beliefs or their values or entertainment than by geographical means. So if you are able to tap into that newly developed world, I think that's an immense opportunity. With that comes Southeast Asia, comes the Chinese market, Africa. So how do you tap into those developing economies and create, if you're bringing something as good as the value of play, how do you bring that to those societies? So I still think that's one of the biggest opportunities. What I do believe that the biggest risk is that companies are not realizing that things are changing very fast, and that things that were given for granted, international trade, free trade, no barriers, free capital movement, political democracy as the mainstay of what we thought, that is all changing. And especially consumer goods companies, not as much the heavy, hard goods companies. They do a lot more of strategic analysis on socio-economic and political factors. I think consumer goods companies, they gave that as a given. I mean, not even the exchange rate between the yuan and the dollar was something overlooked with frequency. So the fact that we need to deal with these long-term implications of a new political climate and nationalism coming along, good for some business, maybe not as good for other ones. But you need to create scenarios to deal with a lot more, much more uncertainty, and be ready for something that is of high magnitude in a very small period of time. Coming from Latin America and from Venezuela, I tell you, we would always check those things and put them in balance.
So I actually agree with both of those comments. I think the biggest threat that we really see is the supply shortage on the labor side. We're going to see rising wage rates. We certainly are feeling that. And by the way, it's great for our employees. If you want to take a look at what's going on in medium and real wage increases, we are seeing that now. I mean, our employees are definitely seeing it. We have 7 plants between US, Canada, and the UK. And we're seeing that really sort of across the board. I agree with Carla Hill that the workforce development is really key right now. I think the community colleges really can play a very vital role. Someone who's graduated high school but doesn't necessarily need college can really help in whatever the local industries that they have in where the community college is located, to give them, whether it's high tech if you're in Northern California, or in the energy industry if you're in Texas or other places. I think they can play a real role. But I am very concerned about increasing wage rates and the lack of capacity build that's going to lead to higher inflation. So I do see that happening, and I expect that the Fed is going to continue to raise interest rates. That's actually going to strengthen the dollar. I think that's going to negatively impact us from an export market. We're battling that by the investments that we've made in manufacturing in terms of robotics, numerical controls. We've made really huge investments. in those areas. By the way, every technology, whether we put a robot, we've never laid anybody off because of that, and that gives us the trust. And our employees really are a real source of great ideas. So I think that's a real opportunity for us. And in terms of our global market, we sell wherever there's Western quality construction in growing markets. And so we think there's lots of opportunities for global trade for us.
And closing comment, we're over time, but what do you think? Risk, opportunity?
Yeah, again, I think I agree with all the comments made here. Nothing significant to add except to say that I think at the heart of all this, to stay ahead of the curve, is the people as well as the innovation.
We're going to hear about some innovation in just a minute here. So everybody, thank you. Like I said, our wonderful speakers, they do hang out, and if you've got questions, these are folks who are not short on opinions. So, so let's mingle.